In March of 2002, United States CIA paramilitary officers would embark on a mission to the Shah-e-Kot Valley and the surrounding Arma Mountains of Afghanistan in an attempt to quash Al-Qaeda and Taliban forces once and for all. As 1,700 troops were airlifted in, hopes were high that a decisive victory was on the cards. The intelligence had estimated that between 200 and 250 terrorist insurgents were nestled in the valley. But unfortunately, this information was incorrect. As the troops dropped in and prepared to fight, they were met with calculated mortar fire and a barrage of machine gun bullets, as between 500 and 1,000 terrorists fought with everything they had. This was Operation Anaconda, and it would prove to be the bloodiest battle of the Afghan War. But who would emerge successful, and how would the conflict play out? In today's video, we will be recounting the events before, during, and after Operation Anaconda, taking a look at just what unfolded across that 2-week period, and what was supposed to have happened. We will be meeting key figures involved in this battle along the way, and break down the biggest moments of the conflict one by one. Join us as we discover the shocking reality of the deadliest battle of the Afghan War. Welcome to Wars of the World. Operation Anaconda was intended to be a major turning point in the Afghan War, as the United States military attempted to stamp out the terrorist threats of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban for good. The battle occurred rather early on in the Afghan War, in fact less than a year after Islamic terrorists hijacked the planes that would be flown into the World Trade Center, spurring on the conflict that would be known as the War on Terror. In these early days of the war, the United States' primary objective was to eliminate the terrorist threat quickly, locate Osama bin Laden, and prevent the spread of extremist ideologies. Prior to launching Operation Anaconda, the United States instigated Operation Enduring Freedom in October 2001, mere weeks after the 9/11 attacks. This involved teaming up with a local rebel organization in Afghanistan, known as the Northern Alliance. This consisted of Uzbeks, Hazaras, and Tajiks, who were actively opposing Taliban rule. Operation Enduring Freedom was carried out with a mixture of airstrikes and ground operations that would take the fight directly to any and all known terrorist cells in the country, and it was, for the most part, a great success. A series of Taliban centers of power were claimed quickly, and by November, the United States and the Northern Alliance were in control of Kabul, Afghanistan's capital city. What followed, however, was the Battle of Tora Bora, which this time saw the United States military acting without the Northern Alliance, on intelligence that suggested bin Laden had been taking refuge in the Tora Bora Mountains in Afghanistan's Nangarhar province. Prior to the eventual battle in Operation Anaconda, this held the title as the bloodiest encounter of the Afghan War. Ahead of the battle, the United States had managed to enlist the support of Pashtun military forces close to the Tora Bora Mountains, and they had moved in to attack a large Al-Qaeda training camp nestled near to the city of Jalalabad. From the get-go, however, there were concerns about their new allies' commitment to the cause. They were not as vehemently opposed to Al-Qaeda and the Taliban as the Northern Alliance had been, and they intended on leaving the area each night to safely break their Ramadan fast. Moreover, it turned out that bin Laden and his closest allies were situated at this very training camp, but had managed to leave the scene amidst the disorganized assault. Operation Anaconda, then, was born from a new intelligence report that claimed that Al-Qaeda forces were gathering in the Shah-e-Kot Valley in Afghanistan's Paktia province, south of the city of Ghar, translating to the place of the king in Pashto. Shah-e-Kot is a 9-kilometer by 5-kilometer stretch of rocky crevasse, and it is full of hiding places. Caves and indents into the rock line the valley walls, and a great deal of cover is afforded to troops at ground level by natural rock features. This valley had been the site of an important battle during the Soviet-Afghan War in the 1980s, which saw Soviet forces eventually retreating as Afghan guerrilla fighters had held their ground. By the time the Americans were ready to attack the valley, bin Laden had fled to Pakistan to evade capture, and an American request to intercept him with 800 border rangers had been declined by Central Command. 2001 turned to 2002, and in January, plans were set in motion for American troops to move in. American intelligence had suggested that between 200 and 250 terrorist fighters were stationed across the valley, led by Malawi Nasrullah Mansour. After the Battle of Tora Bora, Mansour had invited jihadists from the surrounding regions to join him in the valley to assemble in the event of an American attack, and his men had spent time planning for just what was to come. Mansour's invitations had attracted between 500 to 1,000 terrorist fighters to the site, each of them well equipped for combat. The valley had been fortified with trenches, bunkers, and ridges upon which to mount machine guns, making it a particularly difficult place to assault. Prior to the start of Operation Anaconda, however, Mansour had been killed in a battle with a rival warlord, and his son, Saif-ur-Rahman Mansour, had become the primary Mujahideen leader of the troops who were stationed at Shah-e-Kot. Despite the junior Mansour's recent rise to power, the terrorists held every belief that, just like in the Soviet-Afghan War, they would be able to repel any American threat that came their way. But would they be right? Plans to attack the Shah-e-Kot Valley were put into place across January and February of 2002. Earlier intel had provided the United States military with the location of not only Saif-ur-Rahman Mansour, but his high-profile wanted allies, Jalaluddin Haqqani and Tohir Yuldashev, both of whom were stationed alongside him. Haqqani in particular was a major threat here. He had fought in the Soviet-Afghan War and knew the lay of the land well. He was no stranger to fighting in the valley, and United States forces deemed him to be extremely dangerous. Over the course of the planning phase, additional intel needed to be gathered and give the Americans an advantage. Satellite imagery and reconnaissance units attempted to reveal as much as possible about the valley and those stationed within, but this proved difficult. The terrorists had camouflaged themselves well against the caves and crevices of the valley walls. Here the United States would need to rely on gathering human intelligence instead. Over the course of the next few weeks, advanced force operations were sent into the lands bordering the Shah-e-Kot Valley to scout out as much information as possible. This involved traversing difficult terrain in poor weather conditions and also in the middle of the night, using ATVs and then travelling on foot to minimize any attention drawn to them. Environmental reconnaissance was conducted high along the walls of the valley, and gradually fed back to the General Tommy Franks, who began putting together a major operation to deal with what was clearly a large terrorist presence in the region. Once intel was gathered, the United States military needed to decide how to go about the attack. They decided to enlist the help of a local Pashtun warlord, Zia Lodin, to lead a tribal force of Afghan soldiers against the terrorists in the valley. Lodin would be fighting alongside US Major General Franklin L. Hagenbeck, commander of the 10th Mountain Division, who would be spearheading Operation Anaconda. They decided to adapt what they had learned from the Battle of Tora Bora. Afghan military forces under Lodin would move in first, but this time the United States military would be stationed in the mountains to the east of the valley. This way, any key terrorist figures attempting to escape to Pakistan would be intercepted and dealt with. The United States would also be enlisting the support of special forces from their international allies: New Zealand, Australia, the United Kingdom, Denmark, the Netherlands, Germany, Norway, Canada, and France. Combined, around 3,000 troops will be amassed near the valley, in the form of infantry, snipers, air support, and specialized soldiers equipped for fighting in difficult mountain terrain. This is how the battle played out. The first events of Operation Anaconda took the Americans by surprise, as they airlifted a team of SEALs to a nearby peak to set up an observation post on the 1st of March 2002. It became apparent that the Al-Qaeda terrorists were well equipped for a fight. They had been joined by Uzbek and Chechen IMU fighters, forming teams that spanned cultures and ideologies. A brief firefight would ensue between the SEALs surveying the valley and a small team of 7 Uzbek insurgents, leading to 5 of their deaths. Nearby, the SEALs were able to find Arabic documents detailing guides on how to construct powerful homemade bombs that would be designed to target bridges, buildings, and vehicles. At this point, it became clear that the United States may have underestimated their enemy. Between 500 and 1,000 insurgents were stationed in the valley, much more than the 200 to 250 they had planned for. While the terrorists were still outnumbered, this would not be an easy mission by any means. The following day, the fighting began on a wider scale. Allied Afghan militants entered the Shah-e-Kot Valley to begin picking off insurgents where they could, while Canadian and United States snipers provided covering fire from the valley's high points. Meanwhile, at the United States military base in Ghar, a large convoy of trucks containing the units of Task Force Hammer departed for the valley. Among them was Zia Lodin, a larger force of his men, and several teams of American Special Forces soldiers. The terrain was difficult, and several vehicles became stuck. Several fighters were injured before the fighting had even begun, as a bus was overturned. Moreover, the element of surprise had been lost, as the trucks turned on their headlights to avoid any further mishaps. Around this time, a convoy led by Army Chief Warrant Officer Stanley L. Harriman separated from the main group to head to the observation point where the SEALs were stationed. Overhead, an AC-130 aircraft providing fire support experienced a failure in its navigational system and did not identify the convoy as American. They opened fire, killing Harriman and wounding several of their own soldiers in a catastrophic case of friendly fire. The battle was not off to a good start. Additional air support that was intended to be provided by an overhead Rockwell B-1 Lancer had failed, as a bomb became stuck in the launch bay. Moreover, the AC-130 that had accidentally killed Harriman had been called off, and troops on the ground became concerned at the lack of air support. While this was happening, the Allied Afghan militias in the valley were being bombarded by mortar fire, and up to 40 were killed or injured. They scattered and refused to advance further, and senior officers in the United States military were beginning to recall the disasters of the Battle of Tora Bora. Shaken but not deterred, they decided to reassign the task of assaulting the valley at ground level to Task Force Anvil. Meanwhile, the soldiers of Task Force Rakassan were beginning to board their transport helicopters and flew south to join the fighters in the valley. These would be the men tasked with blocking the escape routes to Pakistan if the terrorists attempted to flee. As Task Force Rakassan soldiers landed along the northeast edges of the valley, the terrorists were taken by surprise. This bought the soldiers enough time to install security measures and to reinforce their position along the edges of the valley, blocking any escape routes across the border. As Task Force Hammer refused to advance on the ground, the terrorists eventually turned their attention towards the US soldiers of Task Force Rakassan, and they came under heavy fire. As they had been airlifted in, however, they were tailed by Apache helicopters, who assisted them in suppressing mortar teams and picking off insurgents. Still, the terrorists persisted and fired RPG rockets towards them, causing one helicopter to lose its electronics and forcing it to retreat. Along the walls below, in caves and trenches, insurgents began to fire ZPU-1 anti-aircraft guns at Task Force Rakassan and the remaining Apache gunships, while those carrying RPGs continued to send hellfire to the top of the valley. The insurgents equipped with RPGs proved to be particularly formidable adversaries. These terrorists utilized a technique that they had employed while fighting the Soviets, which saw them launch their RPG rockets skywards. The warheads within the rockets would automatically detonate when they reached a distance of 920 meters, launching devastating shrapnel in all directions. This method would allow them to tear into the vital internal mechanisms and electronic systems of the Apaches, and it succeeded. 2 further helicopters were forced to retreat after the Al-Qaeda insurgents launched a savage barrage of rocket fire up above. Despite the brutal assault from below, Task Force Rakassan managed to secure their positions around halfway through the morning of the 2nd of March, and they could begin raining fire down into the valley from their advantageous position above. For the remainder of the day, Task Force Rakassan soldiers maintained their position, while additional Apaches provided air support from above. Meanwhile, at ground level, relief fire from Task Force Rakassan meant that Allied infantry could advance further into the valley. Still, they faced intense fire from the Al-Qaeda insurgents along the cliffs and walls of the battlefield, and early in the afternoon, 10 men were nearly taken out by an RPG rocket that had been fired from one of the eastern foothills. It failed to detonate, however, instead landing in the snowy ground right beside them. Following this was a terrifying assault of DSHK M1938 fire. The terrorists were using powerful Soviet heavy machine guns to attempt to finish what their rocket fire could not. The men on the ground ran for cover, and Staff Sergeant Andrei Ropel was able to call mortar fire into the region, eliminating their attacker. He would later be awarded the Bronze Star Medal with a Valor device for his support that day. However, the mortar teams had now begun to draw attention to themselves, and the terrorists attempted to eliminate the 187 infantry who had launched the previous attack, using mortar fire of their own. Several were wounded, but signalman Martin Wallace of the Australian Special Air Service Regiment desperately began dragging them to safety, earning himself a medal for gallantry. Throughout the course of the remaining day, airstrikes were called in from United States bombers and fighters, which helped to inflict heavy casualties on the terrorists. But still, they continued to aggressively defend their positions. The fighting put a huge amount of pressure on the Task Force Rakhisan soldiers at the southern landing zones, who were short of ammunition and continued to receive particularly heavy fire. Late into the evening, however, an AC-130U gunship, travelling much slower than the fighters and bombers from earlier, provided sustained fire into the bottom of the valley, while these men could be airlifted to recover. Among them, 35 had been wounded, but no lives had been lost. Towards the end of the second day of fighting, General Hagenbeck, who had been in command of Operation Anaconda, decided to relocate the airlifted forces from the southern landing zones to the northern position. Gradually, they would sweep forwards towards the south, eliminating any fighters on the floor of the valley. But it seemed that none had remained. The terrorists had fled to the south, but were still unable to escape to Pakistan. This meant that a path had been opened up to a fortified observation point that was set up at the peak of Takur Ghar, an excellent vantage point to gauge enemy numbers. Following the heavy fire that the Apaches and AC-130s had been met with, Hagenbeck decided to send in 5 A-10 Thunderbolt II aircraft, which were less susceptible to ground fire. The Thunderbolts would provide vital air support, while Allied forces moved further south to stamp out the remaining terrorist threat. Among the men who were tasked with heading to a landing zone close to the base at Takur Ghar were 2 SEAL fire teams, Mako 30 and Mako 21, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Vic Hyder. To reach the peak quickly, they would need the support of an MH-47 Chinook helicopter, which had been cleared to land after reconnaissance missions spotted no signs of enemy activity. But around 3 AM on the 4th of March, the Chinook attempted to drop off the SEAL teams. But something was wrong. Tracks in the snow suggested that someone had been there, and very recently. And just as they were contemplating aborting the landing, 2 RPG rockets were launched into the side of the Chinook, shutting down an engine and destroying its hydraulic systems. Petty Officer First Class Neil C. Roberts had been launched from the helicopter as it attempted to perform an emergency maneuver. The Chinook crash-landed approximately 4 miles away, and another was sent to allow the troops to regroup and to search for their missing comrade. The fire had come from the top of the mountain. A large enemy force had amassed at the peak, and an AC-130 was requested to provide fire support. As the terrorists defended themselves, they seriously injured Technical Sergeant John A. Chapman and forced the Mako 30 team off of the peak. Chapman, as well as Roberts, were still alive, but they were stuck and in a bad way. They were now stranded on the mountain and in separate locations. The Ranger Quick Reaction Force was sent in to search for them, while air support continued to eliminate the terrorist fighters on top of the peak. As the first team of Rangers were dropped into the same location initially reached by the Chinook, they fell into the very same trap. They had not been equipped with satellite radios to maintain contact with headquarters. Sergeant Philip Svitak was killed by small arms fire almost immediately, while Chapman, now mortally wounded and spotted by drone footage, attempted to draw fire away from the Rangers as they landed. Private First Class Matt Commons, Sergeant Brad Crows, and Specialist Mark Anderson would also lose their lives as they attempted to retrieve Chapman. At around 8 PM on the 4th of March, the Rangers were extracted from the mountain. Both Chapman and Roberts had died before they could be retrieved, and it is thought that casualties would have been even higher if it were not for a concealed unit of Australian soldiers who had called in air support towards the peak of the mountain. While many terrorists were killed across the Battle of Takur, the multiple Allied deaths that took place led to this being considered a Pyrrhic victory for the Americans. The next phase of the operation was to completely clear the presence of terrorist fighters from the Kot Valley, and fresh troops were brought in to assist with this task. Following the devastating events on the peak of Ghar, United States commanders opted to take a more indirect approach, and there wasn't a great deal of large-scale fighting for the remainder of the 2-week battle ahead. On the 10th of March, 400 American troops were sent back to base, while Zia Loden and his men began to form a final offensive sweep along the valley floor, picking off insurgents and ridding nearby settlements of terrorist presence. Loden, however, had a long-standing animosity with Gul Haidar, one of the key Afghan officers who would be assisting him. As such, communication between the two was strained, and the two could not agree on a method of entering the valley in order to sweep it. American forces eventually convinced them to cooperate, and they headed into the valley on the 12th of March. Loden and Haidar had settled on a pincer movement, reinforced by a team of T-55 tanks. Haidar proved to be invaluable to the operation, and personally saw to the removing of mines that had been placed along the valley floor using a grabbing hook. Meanwhile, Loden and his men approached from the south side, and the two teams began clearing small settlements, confirming that any terrorist presence had been eliminated by the prior events of Operation Anaconda. With very few terrorists remaining, efforts shifted to counting and collecting Allied bodies, and confirming enemy casualties. By the 13th of March, Task Force Rakistan had been replaced by the 10th Mountain Division, who began sweeping the walls and cliffs around the side of the valley. Efforts to catch up with any terrorists that had escaped were unsuccessful, but all of the Pakistan routes maintained their position. The enemy had not left the country. By the end of the 13th of March, estimations on casualties had been confirmed. 8 United States soldiers, sailors, and airmen had been killed, with a further 82 being wounded. Between 500 and 800 rebel insurgents had been killed, and at least 14 civilians had died during the widespread airstrikes. The remaining rebels are believed to have taken the mountains, but their numbers were severely reduced by this point. The final engagement of Operation Anaconda came on the 17th of March, when Task Force 11 caught wind of a high-value target who may have been moving through the mountains to an unmanned Pakistan escape route. A Predator drone was tailing the convoy, and it became an urgent matter to intercept them before they could escape. Task Force 11 headed out, backed up by Rangers and British SBS operators, with Chinook helicopters being sent to transport them ahead of their targets. The terrorists were stopped in their tracks, as one of the Chinook miniguns rendered their vehicles useless, killing a number of rebels in the process. As SEALs closed in with additional fire, the fight was drawn to a close in mere minutes. Using the element of surprise, they had killed a large number of insurgents quickly, and among the dead were well-armed Arabs, Chechens, and Uzbeks. If Task Force 11 had not acted in time, these men would have escaped to Pakistan, where they may have taken intel to Al-Qaeda and Taliban forces regarding the events of Operation Anaconda. By the 18th of March, General Tommy Franks brought Operation Anaconda to a formal close, referring to it as an unqualified and complete success. Investigative reports refuted this claim, describing it instead as a debacle plagued by squabbling between the services, bad military planning, and avoidable deaths of American soldiers. Operation Anaconda did succeed in removing much of the terrorist presence from both the Kot Valley and the surrounding lands, but the numbers didn't add up. While the United States military claimed that 500 to 800 terrorists had been killed, only 23 bodies were recovered, and speculation arose that the operation may have been more of a show for the media rather than a military necessity. Moreover, the Allied coalition forces that had accompanied US soldiers began to criticize the operation after it came to a close. In one interview, German Special Forces KSK soldiers reported heated arguments with American forces. The latter is said to have used excessive violence, condoning the killings of civilians in Afghanistan. In one instance, an Afghan shepherd with no Al-Qaeda ties stumbled into a German hideout, and as such, the military opted to change position. This was met with criticism by the US soldiers, who insisted the Germans should have killed him there and then. After Operation Anaconda, the United States military, along with the coalition forces, launched Operation Jacana, a series of follow-up missions that aimed to stamp out insurgents from the Kot Valley, who attempted to regroup on Afghanistan soil. British forces were prominent in these operations, and over 1,700 men were deployed to support Operation Jacana. At the time, it was believed that many more battles would follow in the coming weeks and months, but in reality, Operation Anaconda would be the last major battle in Afghanistan for several years to follow. Despite their best efforts, several key terrorists did escape to Pakistan following Operation Anaconda, after the soldiers stationed along the valley walls and cliffs moved out. For a long time, Allied forces played the waiting game, anticipating major battles that would just not come. Patrols continued to scout out the mountains, attempting to find any signs of enemy activity around the Kot Valley, but nothing major was revealed. The Taliban, on the other hand, are believed to have portrayed Operation Anaconda as a major historical battle, describing it as, quote, the beginning of the sacred jihad against the occupation of Afghanistan, end quote. Saif-ur-Rahman Mansour had survived the battle, but would be killed in 2008, now an exalted martyr for the terrorist cause. Operation Anaconda was a difficult point of the war in Afghanistan. By all official accounts, it was deemed a success, and many terrorist fighters were brought down, but it certainly was not without its failings. Afghan militants who were supporting the battle tend to believe that a lower number of enemies were killed than the Americans account for, and the actual number has not been secured to this day. Nonetheless, it is known that several Allied soldiers tragically lost their lives amongst the fighting, especially when faced with the horrors of the Battle of Takur Ghar. The operation was a brutal opening to one of the longest of Americans' modern conflicts, and would indeed prove to be the bloodiest encounter in the war in Afghanistan.